Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation, and it's my pleasure, in partnership with the American Interest, to welcome you to this discussion today about President Obama 1 year on. I'm just going to quickly run through some familiar housekeeping items. If you haven't already turned your BlackBerries and other mobile devices off, this would be a good time to do it. We've got a lot of electronics in the room, so even silent might not be good enough to prevent buzzing and other unfortunate noises. You can see as we proceed that we've got lots of cameras with us today. We're live streaming on a couple of sites. There's also C-SPAN and others here pre-recording. So later in the program, when we do move to audience questions, please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and be brief and ask a question, and no speeches, please. You'll find me cutting you off very quickly if you become a self-appointed panelist. We have an excellent panel that is mostly physically present, but partially electronically present, or will be dialed in as we go along. I'm not entirely briefed on how that is going to occur, so I will trust that the crack New America staff will wave or otherwise signal when the time comes. I don't know whether we have distributed the order of battle here, but the first of the audio presentations will be about third in the order of speakers as we go quickly through some introductory remarks and then turn to a discussion. I'm going to introduce everybody and get out of the way until the initial presentations have been made. But I thought that I would just offer one quick frame. This was, in many ways, the brainchild of Adam Garfinkle and his team at the American Interest to commission a series of essays assessing President Obama's performance in office 1 year in. I think reading that the invitation seems to have been fairly open-ended, though the invitations went to people who tended to comment more on his performance as in foreign policy and national security affairs, though I imagine the discussion will cover many other subjects. And it's obviously an arbitrary choice to wait for a year to pass and think about a presidency and assess it. But if you think about the last three presidencies, I was reflecting on this, in the autumn of each of the last three presidents' first year, something happened that established a pattern that defined their performance, at least in international affairs, for the next for the rest of their presidency. In the case of Clinton, in October of 1993, you had Somalia, Black Hawk Down, and the decision to leave. And from that, you get to Rwanda, and then you get to Kosovo, and you get to the whole second term. Much more momentously, obviously, in George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush's presidencies, you had both 9/11 and the fall of the Berlin Wall within a year of office, and a sense of pattern that was pretty easy to identify by this time of that year. I think here we're probably searching more for pattern than reacting to an obvious one, and that will be part of, I think, the frame of the discussion today. I take note of the lack of gender balance in our presentation because I'm very sensitive to this issue, and I just would point out that the issue has a better performance than the random acceptances of our invitations. Jessica Matthews and Ann Applebaum, two very important voices in American discourse, are present in the magazine. I urge you to read their voices. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it today, even by telephone. So I just want to acknowledge their work and note their absence. Let me quickly run through the lineup of folks, some of whom you will know quite well. Walter Russell Mead, who immediately is to my right, is the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations based in New York. He's also a board member of the New America Foundation. He is the Brady Johnson Distinguished Fellow in Grand Strategy at Yale. Boy, that's a pretty good title. He writes regularly for the LA Times, New York Times, and lots of other places. His most recent book, I believe, is actually the Gold book.
God and Gold.
God and Gold, yeah. But here I'm also referring to his in his oeuvre, Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, which received the Lionel Gelber Prize in 2002. And God and Gold came out, I think, last year or the year before. John Ikenberry is the Albert Milbank Professor of Politics and International Relations at Princeton University and the co-director of the Princeton Project on National Security. He's been a transatlantic fellow at the George Marshall Fund, fellow many other places, and has also served on the policy planning staff at the State Department. He's written several books, none of which is listed here, so he can talk about that as he weaves his remarks. Richard Perle is resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, co-author with David Frum of An End to Evil, How to Win the War on Terror. He was chairman of the Defense Policy Board and, of course, Assistant Secretary for Defense during the Reagan administration, was previously a defense staff member for Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. Stephen Krasner, who I believe is the second of our telephone speakers, John Ikenberry being the first, is Professor of International Relations at Stanford University. He was also on policy planning's staff in 2005 to 2007 and has written 6 books and dozens of journal articles. My colleague Steve Clemens directs the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation and writes and publishes the political blog The Washington Note. It appears regularly on television and radio, and has served as Executive Vice President of the Economic Strategy Institute, as well as a Senior Policy Advisor to Senator Jeff Bingaman. And he was the first Executive Director of the Nixon Center. And Will Marshall, I think, who is next to Steve's left, is the President and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute, an organization devoted to modernizing progressive politics for the global age. PPI's work helped create many of the new Democrat ideas of the Clinton administration and has influenced and worked in Europe as European parties as well. He's the co-editor or editor of a number of books, including Memos to the New President and With All Our Might, a progressive strategy for defeating jihadism and defending liberty. And finally, Ronald Steel, Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the University of Southern California, former fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., as well as the Berlin Academy and elsewhere. He's previously taught at Yale, Rutgers, Wellesley, Texas, Dartmouth, GW, UCLA, and Princeton. Obviously has a problem holding down a job. But he ended up in a good place, so he must be a very effective teacher. And he's written in the New York Review of Books, the New Republic, lots of other places, the Atlantic. So really a terrific group. And the last person I want to introduce will, I think, offer a stage setting rooted in the issue of the American interest itself, since he conceived and edited. He can tell us a little bit about what he was trying to solicit from these writers. Adam Garfinkle is the editor of the American Interest magazine, and he was previously editor of the National Interest, which, as I come to understand, is a predecessor of the American Interest. He's served as an NSC, as a staff member of the National Security Study Group of the U.S. Commission on National Security, which was the Hart-Rudman Commission, and an aide to General Alexander Haig, a special assistant also to Scoop Jackson. He's taught U.S. foreign policy and Middle East politics at Penn and at SAIS, and is the author of a number of books on U.S. foreign policy. Please welcome Adam, who will get us started.
Thank you. I'm not going to take up much time because I want to hear the discussion. I do want to express the magazine's gratitude to Steve Cole and Steve Clemens for setting this up. It's a wonderful thing. We should do more of these co-sponsorships in the future. What I was trying to do with this symposium, but before I tell you more about that, you know, there's 16 contributions to the symposium, and we have here about 7 or so either present or. But it's kind of good that the representation that I tried to evoke in the symposium as a whole is pretty much in microcosm represented by the folks we have. Again, sorry that Jessica and Ann couldn't pull their weight on this one, but the sort of spread that I expected to find in assessments of the first year, I think will be represented pretty well today. And that's what all I was trying to do, really. There's nothing really cerebral or special about what I did. I just wanted to get a group of experienced and intelligent people to do the best they could in sizing up the first year. And what I asked people to do, and what they mostly did, was not to get lost in a particular subject, but to stand back and look at the intersection of politics and policy on a large scale, and to look at statecraft, that is to say the intersection of international politics and foreign policy on the one hand with domestic politics and policy on the other. And not everyone did all of that, but I think most people took a stab at the right focal level to do it, and I think we got a pretty interesting group of essays, stimulating group of essays. And I must say that for me it was rather easy. I didn't really have to edit anything. I didn't take a spoon or a knife or anything and carve out a huge amount of overlap, because there wasn't a huge amount of overlap. The various views, the various policies, the various attitudes all come through with the personalities of the authors, and I really didn't have to do much of anything. So I'm very grateful for that. We do these things from time to time in the American Interest. I want to just note one other peculiarity of the symposium, and then I'll shut up. Everybody involved, with one slight exception, is an American. I could have solicited views from people all over the world about what they thought Obama's first year looked like and how he was doing. But that would have been pretty ungainly and I think sort of hard to control. So I kept it just to Americans. But I want to just mention to you that about a year or so ago we put out an issue, looked like this, called The Global Election. We did a similar symposium. The question then was, what does this election, upcoming election in the United States, mean for you in your country? And we had 25 or 26 or 27 short pieces from all over the world, none of whom was an American national. So I think now we're balanced anyway in at least these two symposia. So with that, I'll again thank you for coming, leaving your sleds and your dogs outside, and I'll turn it over now to Steve Cole to get us underway.
Well, all that's left for me to say is that we're going to start with statements of about 5 minutes each by each of the participants, and you're free to sit or stand. And Walter, you're up.
C-SPAN would prefer standing.
Prefer standing.
Podium,
Okay.
yes.
I take note of C-SPAN's preference, but feel that you're not to be controlled by it as you like. Walter, you're first.
Okay, great.
Well, it really is great to be here at the kind of intersection of two of the real interests in my life. I've been associated with New America Foundation one way or another really since it started, and very much enjoy being a member of the board. And I'm also on the executive committee of the editorial board of the American Interest. So two of my obsessions have come together to bring me here this morning. It's also true that my third and newest obsession, which is the blog I've started on the American Interest, is a part of this event, because it was originally, the essay I contributed was originally a blog post and kind of developed from there. So what I tried to do in the essay was to talk about not just the intersection of domestic and foreign policy, because that's important, but to talk about the intersection of history and politics, both foreign and domestic. And President Obama really invited us to do this, maybe more than he knew a year ago, when, as you recall, there were a lot of comparisons of President Obama and President Lincoln. And I was a little nervous when I started hearing all of these, because one of the things you'll notice about President Lincoln, if you go back and look at his record, is he didn't sally into Washington talking about the comparisons between Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. If anything, he was trying to keep expectations low rather than high. I think if there's one thing that President Obama has been learning in this first year in office, it's that it's really hard to be President of the United States. Really, it's a nightmare of a job. Because American power is about two contradictory things. On the one hand, we are as a global leading power, we're going for stability around the world. We're trying to keep the status pretty much quo. On the other hand, as this kind of dynamic seething source of innovation and capitalist renewal and all these other things, we're the leading arsonist of the world, going around setting fires and upsetting the status quo. In that sense, we're causing as much trouble when we're inventing the internet as when we are invading Iraq. We are blowing up the status quo at the same time we're trying to defend it. And the President of the United States is caught at the vortex of these conflicting pressures. President Obama, I think, has been feeling that this year. The biggest event since the issue came out, and one I think we really ought to note this morning, is the conference in Copenhagen, where you saw President Obama having to wrestle with all of these tensions. I mean, can you imagine the nerve it took to walk, to sort of walk into closed-door sessions as the President of the United States, blowing up diplomatic protocol, wrenching the Copenhagen Assembly out of its original approach and into something new, and doing this not knowing if it was going to work. In the article, I wrote about an important moment, I think, for President Obama, and one that is for President Lincoln, and President Obama will get to this, I think, one way or another. And this would be in the summer of 1864, near the end of President Lincoln's first term. The re-election campaign is going, and it's not going well. In fact, he and all the political experts in the country think he's going to lose. And furthermore, think he's going to lose to a candidate, General McClellan, who will not pursue Lincoln's core policies in the Civil War. Lincoln, at that point, is living with the idea that he sent hundreds of thousands of young men to their deaths for a failed war. That he'll be known as the president who failed to hold the Union together. He's getting up every morning with that knowledge. He's living with a wife who, frankly, at times was psychotic. He's living with the ghosts of two dead sons and this gnawing sense that maybe it's all going to fall apart. President Obama is going to face times like this, I think. We live in a very tumultuous period in world history. He will not have the comfort of knowing how the story comes out. We and he will be seeing over the next 4 years, 3 years now, what he's made of, what kind of president he's really going to be. I think the early signs are encouraging, but it's still 1 year into his term. It's much too soon to tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. And our first audio participant is going to speak from the heavens with assistance from our staff. So, Professor Ikenberry, the floor is, and the ceiling are both yours.
Thank you, Steve, and greetings to my colleagues. Sorry I can't be there. My essay in the volume was focused primarily on Obama's emerging grand strategy, and I tend to be bullish in these early days and months, taking the view that Obama's general global orientation is on the right track, given a very demanding international security environment. I start, as others do in their pieces, by noting that Obama has inherited a daunting and intractable tangle of foreign policy challenges: wars, two wars, unpopular, unfinished, stalled peace talks, hostile states acquiring nuclear weapons, a broken NPT, global financial crisis, a recession, rising public debt, and growing what I call multipolar challenges from rising China and estranged Russia. My argument is that faced with these quite, as I think I heard just now, tumultuous, from Walter, a tumultuous international environment, I would describe it as a set of threats that are diffuse, shifting, and uncertain. The important question to ask is, has the Obama administration articulated a grand strategy that's responsive to these challenges? My answer is, I think so. Yes, I think it has. because in this sort of environment, the key task, which I believe Obama also seems to be articulating, is for the U.S. to put itself in the midst of building frameworks of sustained partnership and collective action on many, many fronts in many ways, and for challenges that we may not completely understand now or that might come to us in various combinations in the years ahead. I get the sense this is Obama's vision. Philosophically, or how Obama is positioned intellectually in these various competing visions of grand strategy, it seems to me that he is a moderate internationalist with a grand strategy built around both liberal and realist sensibilities. Liberal in his orientation towards engagement, multilateralism, progressive change. Realist in his emphasis on great power restraint, accommodation, looking for ways with Russia and China to work pragmatically despite differences. And in this sense, this synthesis of moderate realism and liberal internationalism puts Obama squarely in the mainstream of post-war presidents who have worked with those dual ideas, starting really with Truman, emphasizing alliances, partnerships, multilateralism, great power, forbearance, and democratic communities. I argue that there are two ways that Obama has made useful grand strategic moves. First, he has, I think, in an unusually clear way and an impressive way from my view, articulated a clear and coherent vision of the U.S. security environment. As I read his speeches and actions, I see really in each move and each speech an emphasis on what he argues, and I think I would agree with, is the master trend in world politics, which is the rise of security interdependence. That increasingly more people in more places doing more things matter to American security. And the U.S. in that context can't be secure alone. It has to be secure together with other states who together work on affecting the environment in which the United States operates. So the U.S. and other states have an agenda here, building frameworks and rebuilding partnerships, attending to security interdependence, which increasingly means not just, as it did during the Cold War, how the Kremlin was thinking about deterrence, but how lots of people doing lots of things, how people burn energy, provide public health, treat minorities, abide by laws and treaties. All of these things matter more today than they did in the past, and they will matter more tomorrow. All of that, this deep, relentless movement of rising security interdependence creates a rising demand for security cooperation that is extensive in scope, institutionalized, multifaceted, intrusive. And as we look into the 21st century, we're going to have to do more of it in more places, in more ways, with more governments and peoples. And in this sense, I think Obama gets it. His focus on reviving the NPT, looking for deep cuts with Russia on the nuclear stockpile, plus the emphasis again on multilateralism, human security, Secretary Clinton's attention to development. All of these are promising markers, I think, in the early period of articulating this grand strategic vision, which is functional and appropriate given the environment that we face over the long term. The second positive strategic step that I think Obama has made is his general recalibration of America's global hegemonic position. I've argued this in the past that the U.S., more than many of us really often appreciate, found itself building an international system over the last half-century where it was really at the center of it. It was like the linchpin in a constitutional order for the world. The U.S. played not just a role as a patron over rules and security partnerships, but it was itself fused with the larger global governance system. The world, in effect, contracted out to the United States for global governance, and it was a good deal for the U.S. and for other parties, and it continued after the Cold War to the surprise of many people. administration.
John, it's Steve
Yeah.
Clemens. I'm just playing back up to Steve Call for. We need a quicker version, just because we've got a lot to do yet. So we just want to bring you, because I can't slip you a 1 minute
my
note.
final point.
Yeah, okay.
That is that the the Bush administration had in effect a kind of constitutional crisis with other parties around the world, and that the Obama administration has, in steps that are at least symbolic but potentially important in the longer term, reestablishing a kind of constitutional bargain with key parties around the world, and this creates the kind of stable framework in which the U.S. can pursue its interests over the long term. For those two reasons, I think the first glimmers of grand strategic vision are very promising. Thanks, Steve. Sorry for carrying on.
Thank you.
No, you did reasonably well. Thank you. It was very articulate and stimulating. I'm sure we'll come back to some of that during our discussion. Next up is Richard Perle.
Thank you. Good morning. I began my piece by recalling a conversation with a friend commenting on some action by Obama. I don't remember what it was, when he said, "I hope he knows what he's doing." I say in my piece that I hope he doesn't. And the reason why I hope he doesn't is that if there is room yet for discovery, we may find a plan B. I hope we find a plan B, because plan A isn't working. I have trouble finding the strategic vision that Professor Ikenberry just referred to. What I see instead is an attitude toward America's global role, power, and responsibility, which puts an unreasonable, exaggerated emphasis on the open hand, on goodwill, on reversing what I believe the President believes was the psychology of the Bush administration. That open hand has not been received with an open hand by our adversaries. One recalls the President with Hugo Chavez, receiving and thanking Chavez for a gift which is a diatribe against the United States. Or the proposal made numerous times and in a way that becomes almost supplicatory, approaches to Ahmadinejad, which are reciprocated by rhetorical bashing of the President. Just yesterday, Castro, toward whom the administration has attempted what can only be called a reconciliation, accused President Obama of lying. And generosity with respect to Putin in shutting down a missile defense program in Poland and the Czech Republic, largely, I believe, because that's what Putin wanted, was responded to by a Russian military maneuver a few days later that included a simulated invasion of Poland. So I think we're off to a pretty bad start when you get down to the specifics. It seems to me that President Obama has made a fetish out of the cliche, and the cliche is engagement. Obviously, we talk to friends and we talk to adversaries. We talk to friends in the hope of encouraging them to support our goals and objectives, and we talk to adversaries in the hope that we will diminish the dangers that they pose to us. So no one is against talking, but sometimes engagement carries a political price. When you go repeatedly to Iran, which is proceeding apace to develop its nuclear weapons, which continues to support terrorism in a number of places and destabilize the Middle East region, when you go repeatedly to Iran, by the way, as it brutalizes its own citizens, you eventually begin to send a message, and this message has been seen by others in the Gulf, And the message is that we are prepared to accord Iran a position of power that Iranian dissidents and countries near Iran find dangerous and deeply concerning. You can convey a sense of where power lies by the way and the manner in which you engage. And I think the president doesn't understand that. If he had, it would have been a far more disciplined approach to engagement and not repeated approaches which are scorned and revealed publicly as a means of embarrassing the United States. Walter referred to the arsonist setting fires. I think you had President Bush in mind. Sometimes fires are put out by setting deliberate fires. I'm not an expert on fires, but I think you set a fire sometimes to contain a fire in order to deprive the fire you're hoping to contain of combustible material which would enable it to spread and expand. So I'm not against using fire to fight fire. And that's whether it was right or wrong, what I believe President Bush was attempting to do. So one can criticize the way it came out or the judgments on which it was based, but the technique of using fire to fight fire seems to me entirely appropriate. And I hope that President Obama discovers that in time. Professor Ikenberry refers to Obama's global orientation, his grand strategy, looking, for example, for ways to work with Russia. Well, I just referred to one of the ways in which he sought to work with Russia by acquiescing in Russian demands that we not proceed with ballistic missile defense installations in two countries, two allies of the United States in Eastern Europe. I don't think that worked out very well. The focus of the administration's policy with Russia has been antiquated. It's in fact a focus on the arms control of the Cold War when the Cold War is over, and it no longer matters very much to this country how many nuclear weapons Russia has. My own view is that we should be reducing our nuclear arsenal, probably substantially beyond its current levels, reducing it beyond its current levels, but we should do that unilaterally. There's no reason why our implementing what we consider to be an optimum nuclear strategy should be held hostage to negotiations with Russia. During the Cold War, you had to do a whole different sort of calculation. It seems to me we're beyond the Cold War, but we have a diplomatic establishment that in many ways is mired in the Cold War, and the president reflects that. So I hope we'll have a plan B. There may be the glimmerings of a plan B in the president's approach to Afghanistan and his remarks on receiving the Nobel Prize, which are extraordinarily different from everything he said before. In fact, it puts one in mind a little bit of Jimmy Carter's discovery after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that the world was a more difficult and a harsher place than he had previously understood. And I'm encouraged to think that President Obama may be discovering that sometimes force is necessary, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, sometimes engagement is not feasible or cannot be effective. And if we see more of this, we'll be the better for it.
Thank you. We turn now to our second audio presentation from Professor Krasner. Are you on the line?
We have no Steve Krasner.
Ben, any information? All right, we will proceed to the next speaker, and then we will see if...
no, there he is.
Professor Krasner, is that you?
Yes, that's me.
Great. Your 5 minutes is underway. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. I know the ritual is to say, I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but frankly, I'd rather be sitting in California. Let me begin with, I think, two observations that are
not really debatable. I mean, one is that Obama's presidency is going to depend on domestic politics, not on any successes that he might have in the international arena. And the second is that at least in the first year, we've seen changes in atmospherics, but not changes in substance. Here I think it's a fundamental issue, and it's not an issue which has changed from the Bush administration. There are some problems in international politics which are not soluble. They might be manageable, but they're not soluble. And for the most part, the key issues that Obama has to deal with are problems that he cannot resolve. They could wreck his presidency, but they're not going to save his presidency. Let me go over three of these quickly and then end with one issue which some of our panelists, and I know Steve Clemens has already alluded to, which is Iran. Pakistan. It's still stunning to me that there are leading American figures in the administration and outside the administration that refer to Pakistan as an ally. Here's a country that's proliferated nuclear weapons, engaged in terrorism in India and Afghanistan, basically has allowed the Afghan Taliban to function within its own borders, and doesn't appear to have done very much to combat al-Qaeda operatives still working in Pakistan. If we're thinking about what our policy towards Pakistan actually is, the money that we're giving to Pakistan is essentially a fee paid to the Pakistani military to allow us to conduct counterterrorism activities in the border areas. And we should avoid the kind of illusion that we're training the Pakistan Army or developing some sort of reliable ally. But this is not a problem that Obama's going to solve, regardless of whether his stance is the one that John Ikenberry describes, or if somehow President Obama tomorrow embraced Richard Perle and said, you're right. The problem is not a soluble problem. Second, if you look at Israeli-Palestinian relations, the Israelis have basically come to the conclusion, based on empirical evidence, that force works. They tried negotiations, they got the second intifada. They left Lebanon, they got rockets and kidnapping. They left Gaza, they got rockets. They went into the West Bank, they ended terrorism from the West Bank, they built a security fence. They went into Lebanon. This war was regarded at the time, the 2006 war, as highly problematic. They basically have ended attacks from Lebanon. And the invasion in Gaza has resulted in a radical decline in the number of rocket attacks on Israel. From the Israeli point of view, forces worked, and accommodation has failed. And the Palestinians, given their internal divisions, both within the Palestinian Authority and between the Fatah and Hamas, don't seem to be in a position to make anything that looks like a set of credible commitments. If you look at North Korea, the fundamental problem in North Korea, which has been unchanged, regardless of whether we were negotiating or not negotiating, is that the Chinese and the South Koreans are not willing to put the kind of pressure on North Korea which would lead the regime to change its policies, because it could actually result in regime collapse. And regime collapse in North Korea would be unmanageable for South Korea and very difficult for China. Finally, I do want to end on one issue, which I treated a little differently in my piece than I'm going to do here, and that is Iran. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, it could be extremely problematic. Iran wouldn't have second strike capability, so they might mistake an Israeli attack, which was not really an Israeli attack. They have members of their government which have a millennial view about what the world should be like. So maybe you use nuclear weapons to bring the world of God on earth that you prefer. They could use nuclear weapons and give them to Hezbollah if they see their own domestic political position declining even more than it has. Iran is not structurally constrained in the way in which the other crises that I've alluded to are. The Russians and the Chinese, one would have to say, looked at from their own national self-interest, would be better off with a more moderate Iranian regime or even a more moderate set of Iranian policies. One fundamental major challenge for the administration, and I think a challenge on which the administration can be judged, is whether or not it gets Russian and Chinese cooperation in terms of bringing additional pressure on Iran. This pressure could be sanctions. That's obviously what's mentioned. There's also the possibility of a naval blockade. I think there's no real chance of a military attack either from the United States or I would say also Israel. But there are real possibilities for altering Iranian policy. Those possibilities will depend on how adept the United States is in dealing with China and Russia. Up to now, the record doesn't look great. But if we're thinking about judging Obama in terms of what he can actually do in crises where there is some flexibility, I would focus on Iran. I think in other areas he's basically stuck, regardless of whether or not he continues to embrace the general orientation he's displayed in the first year, or moves to some other formulation or grand strategy for the United States. So I would focus on Iran. It's absolutely a key policy, and I'm hoping Steve Clemens will take up these remarks. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Steve.
And indeed, Steve is next to the microphone.
Thanks so much to everyone for being here, and happy holidays, and thanks to Adam for this excellent issue. I'm very pleased that Steve Krasner left us thinking about Iran, because my original suggested title, as we sometimes suggest to editors and publishers but are very rarely heard, was in grading Obama, only Iran matters, was my suggested title. Instead, we got no breakthrough, which was good, but I'm very much taken and agree with much of what Steve laid out. But let me just start slightly in different place, because I do think in grading Barack Obama, and I think I'm like most people, find many aspects of Barack Obama mesmerizing and find the possibilities of both his framing of challenges and his various messages to the international community very compelling. But when you look at what he inherited, and I think Richard Perle and I might disagree, though, when he was quoted in Vanity Fair or something, you had significant criticisms of the last administration's performance. And when you look at the tasks that a president has and the portfolios they inherit, both the economic portfolio, which was clearly in crisis at the time Barack Obama came in, but also looking at the stock of power that the United States had on the national security and foreign policy front, were fairly miserable, and I would argue probably the worst in at least my memory among presidents coming in. And to some degree, when you're a superpower and you engage the world militarily, economically, morally, or through ideas and institutions, you take the top three of those. Militarily, one way or another, we showed key limits in our engagement in Iraq. We showed key limits economically by exporting toxic financial products to the rest of the world. We at least had moral dilemmas as represented by things that happened at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. And to some degree, American leadership in the world became quite in doubt. And the idea of America as a superpower also looked like a bubble. To some degree, Obama himself became the bubble that we replaced the housing bubble with in the United States. We had a colleague here at the New America Foundation some years ago named Dan Gross, who wrote a book called Pop, and it was about the benefits of bubbles in American history and what they've created and the kinds of infrastructure. To some degree, political bubbles can be useful tools as well when gravity is just taking you so down in such a negative path that to some degree it buys you time to rearrange America's contract with the world and to reinvent, to some degree, American leverage. Because what I see as Obama's key challenge, which he has not convinced the world yet, despite what might be coming with health care, though there's a lot of consternation about the content of that, what might be coming in terms of a down-the-road Copenhagen, Obama has not yet convinced the world or American citizens that our nation can achieve the goals it sets for itself. This is what translates into power. Not platitudes, but actually delivering key results. Just before, this is on record, but just before the inauguration, I saw Rahm Emanuel and congratulated him on going into office, etc. And he said, yes, all we can change right now are the optics of things. I think it was a very candid observation that the stock of American power to do the heavy lifting was going to be very, very limited. And I think they did a wonderful job changing the global optics. And I'm one that argued perhaps in a crazy way, but I did argue that for that alone, Obama should be given the Nobel Prize. That substance would or could come later, even though that was clearly important. But changing the realities of the global order and changing the way historical gravity is taking the nation, in my view, means finding opportunities to convince the world that you've got the capable, the ability to reinvent American leverage. And in my view, the administration not only picked defining challenges for itself, which were clearly the three areas where you had envoys, so Iran, Israel, Palestine, and South Asia, the AFPAC challenges. But of those, Iran, in terms of everything else you look at, seemed to me to be the highest national security priority through which all other lenses needed to be viewed. And this is when I go into the pieces, as I look at, to some degree, moving the Russia course and the China course with the United States into different directions, that some might say were less destructive and less on a collision course than they might have otherwise been, only mattered ultimately if that was trying to shape the global order to remove Iran from running room and to decrease Iran's ability to divide great powers around the world. Pushing forward an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal is not in itself important to me. Israel-Palestine matters in the sense that it gives you a pathway forward to possibly look at some soft normalization between Arab states and Israel. And that's vital because it also robs Iran of the ability to both declare itself as the real defender of the Islamic faith, and it robs them of running room and territory. So when you begin to look at that and look at those pieces, I believe on some level Barack Obama does see these moving pieces and trying to move the geopolitical system to move in that direction. But when you look at the team and you look at the very inconsistent performance of that administration, I think you also have to say that ultimately they have failed. My time is coming to an end, but I do want to say just quickly that it's not just foes, as Richard Perle laid out, who are animated by perceptions of American weakness. It's a changed equilibrium and a changed game with allies. When I look at the fact that Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, all fundamental key strategic partners with the United States in various ways, for historical, long periods of time, have each rebuffed this administration, whether it was on economic policy, national security policy, being part of a new game plan in the Middle East or not. I think these are reading as a measure that the United States has not succeeded in any way. You would not be seeing allies behave the way they are. And I would say that finally, when I watched the engagement of Barack Obama over the settlements issue, I'm not one who supported the administration's direction on settlements. I thought it was too narrow a window to go forward, that it would remove the ability to have some latitude and ability to mix in the process. Nonetheless, once the decision was made, you couldn't, as a president of the United States, afford to lose. And I think unwittingly or consequently, the failure of Barack Obama to see that battle through, which ended up being a sumo contest with Benjamin Netanyahu, turned Netanyahu, an ally, into the Khrushchev for this administration, defining the limits of the capability and power of the President of the United States. And the administration has to find a way out of that box. And again, I completely agree with Krasner that Iran is what mostly matters. And when we come back a year from now and take another whack at this, we will see whether or not the United States has made any progress on that front or not. And I would argue, if not, then the world will be sensing that we're in serious political, economic decline. Thank you.
Will Marshall, you're up next.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, two Steves, for the invitation to take part in this conversation. I also want to thank my panelists for leaving me the spacious terrain of domestic politics to cover in 5 minutes. I probably won't be able to do it, but so Steve, get your hook out. But I'll try to touch on some things that we haven't talked about much here that I think are going to bear crucially on how Barack Obama is judged and how he would like to be judged. Because as he told a bunch of columnists the same day he gave his West Point speech, he views his historical mission as the domestic renewal, the internal renewal of the United States. And the conversation so far has focused on the awful inheritance that was dumped in his lap. So let me start by saying that I'm really impressed by this guy's ambition. He has set in motion big changes across a spectrum of some of the most fraught impasses in American political life. And just as high divers get extra credit for complicated dives, I think this president deserves extra credit for the degree of difficulty of what he's taken on, although he has to make the dive, can't belly flop. But I am struck by the fact that he's not dodging any of the tough ones. In fact, the criticism one hears more often is that he's taking them all on at once, and that's foolish and will diffuse his energy and burn down his political capital. But the big question for me now is whether his governing tenacity will match the rhetorical audacity of his words. And I have to admit, at this point in his presidency, the words to deeds ratio still tilts decisively toward words. But there's one undeniable accomplishment that we haven't talked enough about here, and that's the way this administration moved decisively in the first couple of months to stop the nation's economic freefall. And stabilize the financial markets and the banking sector. Now, no president since 1931 has faced as ugly an economic picture, I think, as Barack Obama did. Remember that in the first quarter of this year, real GDP fell by 6.4%. 2 quarters later, we've got modest growth. CBO says that the stimulus package raised the third quarter GDP by anywhere from 1 to 3 percentage points and employment by anywhere from 600,000 to 1.6 million. But more importantly, I think, was a psychological impact, the sort of arresting of the panic that was widespread as this year began. Now, he got an enormous boost from a very open-handed Fed. I understand that, but it does seem to me that the energetic actions helped us prevent something much worse than we've had this year. He did it also without succumbing to any of the feverish ideological advice coming from his own party or from the other side. I mean, he didn't have to nationalize the banks, didn't have to develop a wholly new model of capitalism overnight. So I think he kept his head when others were not keeping theirs. Now, we still face an enormous job crisis that's going to be a big issue for Obama and the Democrats, obviously, as we head into next year's midterm election. We have stratospheric deficits as a cost of these bailouts. The bailouts themselves have sparked a kind of populist reaction, rekindled a strong anti-government kind of populism in this country. That all has to be dealt with. But I think that, and he probably won't get sufficient credit for this, but the worst was averted. We stand on the brink of another big accomplishment, that is a landmark health care reform, which is finally dealing with a glaring inequity in American civic life, the fact that millions of our fellow citizens couldn't get basic health coverage or were vulnerable to injuries and diseases. I think that's a big gain for Obama and his party. But I'm not a huge fan of this bill. It's barely acceptable in many ways. It does reform insurance markets, but it's rather weak on cost control, which is the long-term good that has to happen out of all this. We've got to reduce medical cost inflation to deal with our fiscal problems. And looking at what had to, how we had to buy 60 votes, so there's no question that if President Obama wins on this, it'll be winning ugly. But I think in this dysfunctional political system that we have, just making the system work at all, getting to any kind of accomplishment of this scale is no mean achievement. The healthcare debate, though, highlighted the great political challenge facing this president. I believe he began as a sincere post-partisan. I think he really wanted to push beyond the toxic partisanship in Washington. I have to say, and I'll be partisan here, that I don't think the other party ever gave him a fighting chance to do that. I think it's wandered deep into the ideological fever swamps. And as a result of that, the only debate that matters now in American politics really happens on the progressive end of the spectrum. And Obama's great political challenge now and going forward, and we've seen it in health care, and we'll see it in regulatory reform, and we're going to see it in a big way in Afghanistan, is finessing very deep philosophical cleavages within his own coalition between centrist and the left. Now, in my judgment, this president has ceded a lot of power to Congress to shape his main initiatives, whether it's the stimulus bill or this health bill. It may be, however, given the divisions in his coalition, that he really didn't have much of a choice. So a stronger effort to impose a more coherent policy that reflects some distinctive Obama vision on these issues would have cracked his coalition. So one big question is whether a big win on health care will replenish his capital, will reverse these falling polls that we've seen. That remains to be seen. My guess is that The Senate's appetite for taking on big divisive issues is exhausted for the time being. We're not going to see big movement on climate change or some of the other tough issues. But this president does have to pivot to jobs and fiscal responsibility over the next year. The country's demanding a laser-like focus on the economy. He's beginning to do that. And then a huge challenge for him, which I think will be defining for this presidency, will happen not next year, but in the year that follows as the economy recovers, is how we go from having spent like drunken sailors to a policy of fiscal retrenchment, which this country has got to do. Otherwise, a truly mountainous public debts are going to jeopardize our recovery and diminish our economic sovereignty. And so somehow this president has to encourage more stimulative measures next year and then briskly pirouette to a fiscal exit strategy that shows us how we can get a handle on unsustainable entitlement cost growth plus the $1 trillion deficits that we're looking at for really the rest of the decade. Lastly, I do actually think, though, that the biggest challenge facing Barack Obama, not just Obama, but his party, is Afghanistan. I don't think I wouldn't put Iran in the soluble category, so I don't think it's fair to judge him if he does no better than his predecessors in stopping the Iranian nuclear program or making Iran more tractable or less hegemonic in its ambitions in the Middle East. But Afghanistan is his. It now bears his imprimatur. He has to succeed in this policy, and he is going to be. He and his party are going to be judged on this. You know, Democrats only recently got the monkey off their back of being a party that couldn't be trusted to manage the nation's security. And we cannot afford to fail here. And this president, unfortunately, is in the very precarious position of conducting a war policy in Afghanistan, potentially with more Republican support than with Democratic support. We've already seen signs that he's not going to get a lot of help from his congressional leadership. This is a tough position for a Democratic president to be in, but he must show, it seems to me, strategic stamina in the long struggle to succeed in our goals in Afghanistan and the long struggle against radical Islam in order to convince the public that Democrats can govern this country. And that leads me to my last point, which is that this preternaturally talented president has an amazing opportunity, historic opportunity, once in a lifetime, to consolidate a new governing majority, to effect a kind of political realignment such as we haven't seen since the last one, the Nixon-Reagan one of the late 60s. In order to do that, he has to govern effectively. That brings us back to holding this fractious Democratic coalition together and finding a way forward. So far, he's doing pretty well at that. I'm surprised in some respects. But it's forging this link between the party's domestic reform ambitions and its willingness to defend American interests with resolve in the world, and to and advance American values, liberal democratic values around the world. That's missing. The Democratic Party has been missing this kind of vital link between its domestic and its overseas vision for too long now, and I think one of the principal challenges facing this party is to restore it. Thank you.
Professor Steel.
I want to share with you a few words on leadership, which I realize is an anomalous topic for somebody who's bringing up the rear in this discussion. But let's look at Obama as leader. Obama's a rare thing in politics, an inspirational figure. This is dramatized by the passion of his campaign and the response that it elicited. The very motive of the campaign was hope that he would solve problems for us. It's an appeal resting on promise and symbol more than on performance. There was no performance, so we had to believe that. We had to believe. And I think the decision to award him a Nobel was issued on that was made upon the same for the same reasons, that he would do something very dramatic and resolve issues of war and peace. This notion of promise is not unique in American politics. Reagan had it. Franklin Roosevelt had it. It's also contributed greatly to their success. Jimmy Carter did not have it. The two Bushes did not have it. Admittedly, expectations for them were lower, but it was significant, different, and less successful presidencies. Obama inherited an economy collapsing from capitalist greed and the failure of public regulation. He did it by securing the fortunes of those who caused the disaster, but never explained really adequately to the public why this was necessary. There's enormous anger in the country, as you know, as a result of the federal bailout of these companies. Franklin Roosevelt, by contrast, denounced what he called the malefactors of privilege. And he was not afraid to do so. He didn't want to be universally loved, and he wasn't. But I think the result was a flood of populist anger fueled by those seeking to direct it away from the perpetrators to the victims and the inheritors. Now, on the issue of the largest domestic issue of his presidency, after that, is health care. To offer Americans the kind of security offered as a given to people in economically advanced states. But he never explained to the public exactly how it would work, and why it was essential. He found this off on Congress. He did that for some of the reasons we've heard here today, but I think it was a terrible mistake and resulted in a bill that was not as good as he would have liked, and I think that was precisely because of his lack of involvement. He didn't explain how it would work or why it was essential. He didn't do as FDR did in pushing through the Social Security program, which all Americans now assume as a birthright. What he did was gently offer, but he never aggressively sold. He let Congress decide what the health plan should be and the strategy for achieving it, which is rather like letting generals decide what objectives should be and the strategy should be in Afghanistan. That's not a role for generals. Generals are supposed to carry out a political policy in this country. But I think that's what he's done in both of these cases. Let's compare an analogous situation, if you will, which is Harry Truman in Korea 60 years ago, when confronted with generals who sought a public forum, who had their own policies that they were intent on pursuing, fired MacArthur, faced the irony of a Republican Congress, and ultimately won vindication. This is a country where, as Truman said, the buck stops here. I think Obama has too often allowed special interest groups to compromise and sabotage his agenda. He invoked the mantra of change. He's constantly invoking the mantra of change, but too often he has offered hope, and hope is it's a thin gruel on which a public can prosper. In foreign policy, he's following in George Bush's footsteps by being bogged down in two tribal wars, which he's never been able to adequately explain to the public except under this vague category of combating terrorism. He's head of an alliance, NATO, with no enemies, while behind that shield, if you will, Europe enfolds Russia in a post-Cold War embrace dominated by German economic power. Asia is entering a post-American future. The rise of China confronts Japan and India with a contest for influence. And in this emerging great power game, the U.S. is bogged down in tribal wars in Afghanistan and pushed to the sidelines. I think events in this area are slipping out of American control and to some degree even American influence. Obama's in danger of losing control over his own party, as we saw in the health care defections and the disloyalties and the compromises that has entailed. I think it's likely to spread to foreign policy as well, because the rationale for his policy is unpersuasive. In fact, The strategy is possible, the engagement is possible, only because it relies on mercenaries and a volunteer army. A draft would trigger a popular revolt, as George W. Bush understood in Iraq, and therefore the public is able to dissociate itself from a war which the president has defined as essential to its security. Either the war isn't essential to its security, or the public has to be engaged in it. Obama has great charisma, but charisma is a declining asset unless it's renewed by accomplishment. Obama, I think, has gloriously fulfilled our lowest expectations. But to be the FDR of this generation, he has to do as FDR did. He has to learn to be as tough as he is inspiring. And he must learn that charisma, like beauty, inevitably fades. And then the hard task of persuasion begins. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Adam, for putting together such a diverse group. Very interesting portfolio, obviously a lot of internal diversity of view, both about what has and hasn't been accomplished in this year. I thought I would use my time to do a couple of things. One, ask a little bit about some subjects that weren't addressed, and then secondly, to get you who are here with us, because we're only going to conduct the discussion portion with those who are physically present in the room, to respond to each other a little bit. And I've made some notes I hope that will help with that. On the subject of what wasn't discussed, I was trying to put myself in the position of a Earth Studies PhD candidate at the University of Mars, listening to this panel and following global affairs in the United States very closely over this year. And what wasn't discussed, and there were a couple of allusions to the economic crisis, but of course if you think back to the beginning of Obama's presidency and that transition period and the sense of free fall that the global economy was in and the sense of uncertainty that surrounded the first couple of months of his presidency, equity prices hitting a low in March, no bottom available. And the narrative was of extraordinarily interdependent crisis. But what I want to get to is the narrative of response to that crisis, which involved the birth of the G20 as the preeminent economic sort of shape of the emerging world. And I reflect as well on the scene at Copenhagen that one of you referred to, where I think Walter, where the president bursts into the room. But who's in the room? Brazil, India, China. What is the narrative of these new global power arrangements? And does the president have a vision of a BRIC world or a G20 world or a G2 world that is detectable? And secondly, looking forward to the end of his first term, what is it reasonable to ask of this president in shaping this post-American world, to use another phrase that was present at the time of his inauguration? Walter, you want to take a pass at that?
Sure.
Want to grab a microphone?
Yeah. I think I'd say, first of all, that I'm not so sure that it is a post-American world. And I think for me, one of the lessons of Copenhagen was that Madeleine Albright's phrase still holds: we're the indispensable nation. That doesn't mean we get a lot done, but that nothing happens on some of these global issues. But I think, for example, in Asia, we tend to. I thought the coverage of Obama's relations with Asia was just terrible, in that how little coverage there was to the fact that right after he came back from Asia, the Prime Minister of India came to the White House for a state visit. And that Obama actually, I think, is rather effectively inserting the United States into Asian politics, or rather recognizing the degree to which the rising powers of Asia turn to the United States for some kind of leverage and balance there. I think we are seeing, in this sense, it is a continuation of Bush, a shift of the center of gravity in American foreign policy away from Europe and toward other parts of the world. And that America, if the 20th century was the century of the Atlantic in world politics, the 21st century looks like the Pacific with maybe the Indian Ocean thrown in. And Obama does seem, I think, to be steering the country, or maybe drifting with the current, toward this kind of new alignment. Personally, I think the chances are that this will tend to reinforce a sort of a unique American role in the world, but of a different kind and with a different set of relations.
And so, Richard, Perle, if you accept the premise of a Pacific or Indian Ocean century, what do you think is reasonable to expect this president to achieve by way of inserting American interests into that new balance?
Well, I'm not at all sure that we're going to see a shift as dramatic as is implied. It remains the case, I think, that our diplomatic establishment is overwhelmingly oriented toward Europe. That's where most of our diplomatic activity takes place. It's where most of our interactions take place. It's where our important alliance is. My impression of Obama's visit to Asia was that the Japanese portion of the visit was disastrous. The worst, described by the Japanese themselves as the worst visit ever by an American president to Japan. I don't see a strategy. Sure, a state visit from India makes perfect sense, but I don't see a coherent strategy behind that. Now, what can he do? Clearly, we have to reassure those allies who are likely to be intimidated by the very rapid rise of China. We've got to do a better job of dealing with North Korea. And I think there are options that would entail mobilizing the Chinese to be more helpful than they've been. I'm sure it's right that the Chinese don't want to see a collapse of the North Korean regime, but they're also in a position to insist on at least external behavior. They've not been motivated to do so, and motivating them to do so is a challenge for Obama. Bush failed in this regard. I don't think even tried. Maybe Obama will be more successful. Recognizing that an alliance with India is almost certainly in the strategic interest of both countries, and fostering that would be a very useful thing to do. He's got a problem with Taiwan, where I hope he will continue to take what has become the recent history of American administrations, that is insisting that this dispute be resolved peacefully, and I think it is in the process of being resolved by the emerging economic relationship between China and Taiwan. He can encourage that.
That's very helpful. So, Steve Clemens, as we both complete this section and turn to a sort of sense of back and forth responding to each other's remarks, let me ask you, as a Japan watcher, to offer some comments about this Asia strategy question. First, does President Obama have an Asia strategy? Second, how do you judge the first round of tactical performance, both Hillary Clinton's Asia tour and the president's own? But then, secondly, whether this is part of that answer or separately, I think one of the ways that any reasonable panel would judge the performance of a president in international affairs would be to ask, what might he have accomplished in some of these difficult regional portfolios that he failed to accomplish, or what did he accomplish that another president might have, an opportunity another president might have missed? And here, I quote Richard Perle to you, Steve. He said that President Obama came in having made a fetish out of a cliche of engagement, and that because of this overemphasis on the open hand, symbolically, with consequences for the optics of power, and practically in the case of missile defense in Europe, he essentially got rolled, is the argument. And do you, A, accept that criticism, and B, if not, what is the evidence that engagement produced tactical achievements in the first year that another president less willing to extend an open hand might not have seized, if that isn't enough for you to digest.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. You know, very quickly, and in part as a friendly critique of my friend Will Marshall, you know, who focused on Afghanistan, there was this joke. This is actually a true story. Some years ago, after the Iraq invasion, I went to China, met with the guys running policy planning in China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I said, what is your strategy? What are you guys working on? And he says, we're trying to figure out how to keep you guys distracted in small Middle Eastern countries, meaning that our distraction in there had created such, you know, a smorgasbord of opportunity for China and China's pretensions that just reversing that and actually coming back, let me just argue about the optics of Barack Obama putting a lot of, you know, mileage on Air Force One and going to Africa, going to ASEAN, going to both North and South East Asia has a benefit because it demonstrates that we're back. And there was a fundamental view among Southeast Asian nations and Japan and Korea that during the Bush administration that the United States at the cabinet level had disengaged, and it just fundamentally wasn't a priority. And thus, when various architecture questions were coming up in the region, we were not perceived to be a player. So one of Barack Obama's objectives, just by appearing and going there, receiving Taro Aso, then the Prime Minister of Japan, as his first guest, Hillary Clinton making her first foreign stop, Japan, etc., was to demonstrate, one, we're not going to make a false choice between Japan's interests and our growing and more complex relationship with China. We were going to simultaneously manage those, but that we were going to be embedded with any discussion on broader architecture in the region. Barack Obama declared himself as the first Pacific president. Whether that's true or not, we can debate. I sent all my friends in Europe and had a stroke when they said it, and rekindled this. Does Asia matter to you more than we Europeans, which ignited that. But I think that this other, the broader question of Japan and China, and we can go on to Korea and others if other people are interested, but has this benefited? Could another president have done something or achieved something that he might not? It's a very complex challenge because, in my view, you've had a historic change in leadership inside Japan. A nation, and I think, has put aside what I thought was growing, which was a growing kind of dark nationalism in Japan, and replaced it with the possibility of what I call a negotiated nationalism in Japan. Unfortunately, the party running Japan today doesn't have much experience doing so, and has picked various ornaments that it wants to use as ways to demonstrate change. One of these is Futenma Air Station on Okinawa Air Base, where the United States maintains 39 military installations. And in my view, we're running the risk today of not getting ahead of history and being reactive to it and seeing the entire U.S.-Japan relationship get caught up in a nasty fight that, if we scratch beneath the surface, was rooted in a lot of Okinawan resentment about their place in Japanese society, about the bases, and it was ignited by the rape of a 12-year-old girl by 3 American servicemen. So there's some dark stuff that is beginning to come out, and we're running the risk of letting the broader strategic significance of the U.S.-Japan relationship get sucked down that way. And Obama thus far has shown himself unable or unwilling or unschooled enough to get ahead of that. On the China side, you may remember that Hillary Clinton at the beginning, during the campaign, said to George Bush that she wanted to get him not to go to the Olympic game opening ceremonies, i.e. offending Chinese sensibilities at a very important ego-shaping moment for the country to try to make a point about Tibet and Darfur. In my view, you neither solve Tibet or Darfur with that act, and you raise the costs of Chinese cooperation in many other areas in which you want or need them. The question with Obama, and I think it's complicated because of the economic crisis, are the benefits. I mean, there's no doubt that one of the things that Obama should get credit for is working with the Chinese. I think even more than the U.S. stimulus bailout, the Chinese stimulus package was enormously globally significant. And we worked together in a lot of key ways. I think we assured the global economic system that we weren't going to divorce each other in that process. That was the stabilization mechanism. The question is, if you achieve that mutually, as I said earlier, if Iran is what matters, North Korea is what matters, are you able to have other kinds of leverage where China is actually doing anything to help you achieve your top priorities? I think that's very unclear. And I think that Obama and his team are siloing off too many of these problems from one another and aren't playing their hand well enough to demonstrate a facility to move simultaneously as they need to do. And I do think it's possible. I believe that George W. Bush's father thought in these terms. I think to some degree George W. was trying to do that at the end of his administration. But, you know, if you go back, and I'll finish here, to some degree I'm sympathetic to this notion. I often hear from my readers, you're not giving Obama enough time. And that's kind of baloney. If you look at the first year of every president, I think except Ford, since Dwight Eisenhower, each one of them either had some left curve thrown at them, or they made decisive decisions early in their administration that shaped that, they were so key, that the notion that Barack Obama hasn't had enough time the first year really doesn't stand the test of scrutiny of other presidencies. And so I want him to do well. I really want Barack Obama to do well. I think other presidents, as we've seen them, have a greater sense of strategic payoffs if they invest and downsides if they don't, than this president has shown thus far.
Okay, well, let's come home before we turn to the audience and go to Will and maybe think about the colloquy implied between his remarks and those of Professor Steel. I mean, Will, you observed a lot of ambition in the president's domestic agenda, but more words than accomplishments so far. Let's assume that we get to the State of the Union on February 1st and healthcare reform that has changed the entire structure of the American health insurance market has been enacted, and he's coming forward to celebrate what he will regard as a historic achievement in social policy. At that stage, does Dr. Steele's criticism that he doesn't have the toughness, the vision, the sense of direction that Roosevelt had change in your view? Does your ratio of words to accomplishments suddenly change? What do you think would be reasonable to expect of this president?
Well, I tried to say the same things, I think, in maybe slightly gentler way. I do think this president has ceded too much authority to Congress to shape the main legislative packages that he's pushed, and has not imposed a distinctive Obama vision on them, or much less policy coherence of any kind. But I also tried to say that he's facing a very difficult problem. Look, I think the fundamental issue that Barack Obama or any leading politician faces today is not the economy, it's not Afghanistan, it's not Iraq, it is a broken politics. American people do not think that their politics delivers for them. They don't trust Washington. Trust in governments at an all-time low. They trust neither party. Their trust in Obama is now plunging. Somebody's got to make this democracy work. So if he can get, the health care bill through, and it won't take effect for years, so you're not going to feel any immediate impact, good or ill, from it, really, in truth, but it is an accomplishment. It is showing that somehow, out of the chaos, he could get something large done. I think that may make people more confident about what else he could achieve, and it's going to modestly replenish his store of political capital. I don't want to overstate that, because I think he faces, as I said, the Senate's not going to now want to go to the next hugely divisive issue, which is climate change, and say, yeah, let's talk about raising the cost of carbon fuels in America. I just don't see that happening right now. And that's why I think the president will pivot to the economy and jobs for the next year. But I agree with the underlying point, which is that so far this has been a president who's been almost passive in his approach. He's been willing to lay out broad goals and let his party take the reins, and the results are not beautiful. But the fundamental question is, compared to what? Had he tried to lay out a template for healthcare reform at the beginning, my guess it would look nothing like what we ended up with here either.
Right. Well, and just to finish, turn to the audience a second, and Dr. Steel, I mean, to extend Will's remarks, imagining David Axelrod here at the podium speaking on behalf of the president and healthcare reform, wouldn't the narrative sound like we've been waiting since the 1960s to extend this core agenda of the Democratic Party? In the 90s, we came close and failed utterly. In the intervening 20 years, we've been working with interest groups, the insurers, the doctors, all of the other structural stakeholders in health insurance to set up conditions in which this core agenda of the Democratic Party could be achieved. it was incumbent upon this president to bring that deal home, and that's fundamentally what he's done. So if that's the argument in favor of the president's achievement, presuming that it comes in over the next 4 or 5 weeks, is it really fair to criticize him for passivity in the way that you did in your remarks?
Yeah, I think it is fair because he didn't bring the public with him. There's been this enormous outcry of anger and disappointment and alienation. For him to say, "Oh, I brought it back. I brought it through. Nobody else has done this," isn't an answer. It doesn't satisfy those who say, "You brought an answer that was not my problem," which is the case for many people who have insurance. And you didn't persuade me that the cost of this was not going to be detrimental to my interests. What's happened is he's been seemingly largely absent from the debate. He may be pulling the strings to some degree behind the scene, but then we have people we've never heard of, like a senator from Nebraska, becoming one of the key figures in the health care debate over relatively petty issues. I think that there's a sense that, I think it's unjust, but I think it's understandable that the public feels that decisions are being made that ignore their interests. They haven't been persuaded by the president, the way in which it works for them, and the anger is a result of, I think, a sense of exclusion. So instead of Obama saying, "We are doing these things, we, not my administration, but we, the American public, have to change the system because so many of us are suffering from it," it's rather that he's saying, "Well, now you senators, you Nancy Pelosi, or what have you, and you Harry Reid, now you work a deal with your colleagues." The Congress doesn't have that much respect in the country anyway. They're always suspected of doing deals to the public's detriment, which is often the case. But therefore, it's up to him to be the spokesman for the public. And I don't think he's ever. I don't know if he's realized it, but I don't think he's ever done it. And that's what a president has to be.
Did you want to say something quickly,
Just
Will?
make one small point. I agree with the last point very much, which is that Obama has not appealed over the heads of Congress to the country and to the constituency that helped elect him very effectively, which has been one of the big surprises for me. However, just on public opinion narrowly, it's mutable. Public opinion is strongly in favor of health care reform when we started out, and if we get something that looks like a success and with some artful selling of it in that sense by the president, my guess is it's going to go back up. It's like the Iraq War. Americans were for it before they were against it, and I think you're going to see something of the same kind of correction on health care.
Richard?
I think healthcare could become the poster boy for what Professor Steel is talking about, which is a profound disappointment in the way the public's business gets done. And all the details are not known, of course, but the manager's bill introduced by Harry Reid, in which hundreds of aspects of the legislation were changed, in many cases to accommodate the buy-off of individual senators with individual appropriations, is, when it's fully reported, is going to be, I believe, profoundly disappointing. Yeah. It was not the way to deal with an issue of this magnitude. Healthcare is too important for that kind of legislative treatment, and I think Obama's going to pay a price for that.
Yeah. Walter, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's just, in terms of the mutability of public opinion, it is interesting to see that right now, both the surge in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq are more popular in some ways than health care. That is, a higher percentage of the population thinks that the war in Iraq was a success than supports the current health care package. When a large domestic welfare program is less popular than long, inconclusive foreign wars, you are not managing your portfolio well, whatever else can be said about what's going on here. So I think there is a problem. Will may be right that once there's something to see, people will start liking it more and start seeing some benefits, although some of that may not come very quickly since it's not going to take effect. But right now, it is bad. There's no way to avoid that, I think.
Well, the president has established this pattern with difficult policy processes, as in Afghanistan, of waiting till the end to come in with a sort of Hail Mary speech to try to clarify what he had accomplished. And in the case of Afghanistan, the West Point speech was, I didn't think, particularly successful. If it hadn't been followed by the Nobel speech, he probably would have been judged to have lost a little bit of his touch. Let's turn to the audience. Yes. Please wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a succinct question, unlike myself.
Michael Lame of Rethink the Middle East. Mr. Mead, about a week ago, you graded the administration, and while you gave Obama's administration B- on both domestic and foreign policy, on Israel-Palestine, you gave them a D, and you said the only reason you didn't give them an F was because there was still time. So, one, what does it say about, on larger issues, about Obama, who he's listening to, his decision-making process, that one has gone so badly? And two, how to prevent it being an F in succeeding years?
Okay. Well, again, I think since he got an F on that, but a B- overall, it does suggest his decision-making process may have been different on this. I think, his big mistake, it seemed to me, and I don't think you can avoid concluding it was a mistake, was he asked Israel to give him something he had no way to make them give if they didn't want to, the sort of complete, total settlement freeze. And once he had put that out there in public, then that was going to be the yardstick not only by which domestic opinion in the U.S. judged him, but Arab opinion. Because he said, look, I'm going to be different from those other presidents, and I'm going to listen to you, and now I'm putting this out front as the marker of how I'm different from those other presidents. Then he fails to achieve it. And the Arabs use the Israeli failure to do this and say, well, we don't have to do anything now because they're not doing what you asked them to do. Now to try to get the peace process going again, he's in this awful position of saying, they haven't done everything I wanted, but it sure looks nice. And the Arabs are just sort of going, oh, yeah, great. It's a bad situation, and it's entirely self-created. There was no objective force making him set up that, structure it this way. In fact, the concessions that he's gotten from Netanyahu are actually fairly substantial. And had he set this up in the beginning, this could have maybe looked more like a win than a loss. But he has created a difficult situation for himself. I don't think there's an immediate way out, but fortunately in the Middle East, one event is always followed by another, and I think there are some opportunities going forward. Hopefully, this has been a lesson for him, and some folks who told him very confidently that this was the way to go. Maybe he won't listen to them with quite such trust next time around.
I'm looking for some gender balance here. Come on. All right, I'll go to this gentleman, not in pursuit of gender balance.
Talk about self-created
exactly.
problems here.
Exactly.
I'm glad you remarked the distinction. I'm Mike Wolshausen, Contemporary Review. Compared to a president like Harry Truman or George Herbert Walker Bush, President Obama seems very evidently narcissistic. Is narcissism a political vulnerability, a political strength, and how does a president who appears very evidently narcissistic, harness that to augment, to increase the public good?
Yes, Steve.
There's a very interesting book that many journalists revile because the journalist who wrote it got very close to the president. This is by Richard Wolff, the book called Renegade, The Making of an American President. But if you read that book, you're really reading the official, essentially as close to an official biography approved by Barack Obama as you will get. And what's fascinating is to see how he does see himself in some of these issues. And, sidestepping the narcissism question, it is interesting the metaphors. It is interesting. But let me just say this. In terms of what turns Obama on, what animates this man and his attention, and I think you've seen it over and over and over again, from Afghanistan to Cuba policy to Israel-Palestine, there are cases where he grows distracted and disinterested to things that have moved on well or that have been delegated. It's the things that are losing, or where he can walk in like the Michael Jordan at the last moment and change the game and make himself the deliverer of an outcome that was otherwise unachievable. And this is the narrative we're getting out of Copenhagen, that he walked into a meeting that was supposed to be essentially a bilateral with China. The Chinese were trying to evade him, and he broke in and sat next to Lula from Brazil, changed the game, and got this deal, this five-power deal, whatever. And it perfectly fits this narrative of Obama saving the day of what would have been complete disaster. And, you know, I don't want to get into great detail, but I've noticed this in Cuba policy, which I track closely, where even up to 2 or 3 days before the Summit of the Americas, his Sherpa, Jeffrey Davidow, the ambassador, former ambassador to Mexico, was essentially delivering, excuse this, Richard, the neoconservative line on Latin America. There was no evidence at all that they were willing to say to pre-position where Obama was going to do. When he got the portfolio, 180-degree shift in the direction. And so this is interesting that you set up, one, attention challenges, that you've got to be losing terribly to get his attention. But when you do get his attention, there's a need, almost a need, to actually fundamentally change the dynamics and to feel that. And when you get those successes, show that narrative and story. So,
all right, as moderator, I judge that adequately responsive to the narcissism question. That was good. Bob.
Yeah, hi, this is Bob Dreyfus with The Nation and Rolling Stone magazine. I wanted to pick up on Iran a little bit. John Bolton said a while ago that we can't really stop Iran at this point from getting a bomb if they want one. And regardless of whether that's their intention or not, aren't we kind of setting ourselves up for failure to say, okay, our goal is now to stop this enrichment program in its tracks, when the rest of the world, I think, is coming to terms, China, Russia, the Arabs, the Europeans, with the idea that we're going to have to either accept it or contain Iran or something like that is going to happen. And here's the United States saying, no, 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 we want to continue the Bush policy of saying Iran has to stop its enrichment program. So why not change the policy to say, okay, we'll allow Iran to enrich uranium under these terms and inspection and so on, or otherwise, then we are setting ourselves up for failure. And that's why I think it's wrong to make it a test, Steve, because if you make the test something you can't achieve, then of course you're going to get an F.
Well, obviously, I believe you can achieve something. I don't agree with that narrative, and I don't believe that the scenario with Iran is automatically one that depends on completely.
So what's achievable?
Well, what I think is achievable is changing the environment around Iran, both within the Middle East and with other great states like India, China, and Russia, to essentially both rob it of running room to spread, its influence through transnational terror networks, but also to close down some other opportunities. But then to offer it what I think Obama wanted to, which was a constructive course out of that. I'm not a believer in the kind of Hillary Clinton-style coercive diplomacy at this moment, because I don't believe the United States has the wherewithal to achieve that. But I don't think we've put on the table a strategy with Iran that ultimately will change the direction. In fact, I worry about the sanctions policy, because the sanctions policy is not going to dissuade Iran from moving down. It becomes an emotional and political holding place for our fears and ambitions, not something that will necessarily be efficacious in moving in the direction. So
okay, that's good. And so, Richard, what do you think is achievable? And also, if you recall it, Professor Krasner referred to a series of ratcheting coercive steps leading towards a blockade but stopping short of a military attack that he thought would achieve something worth paying the cost for. What's your view of what's achievable and the means to get there?
Well, I think everything now must be put in the context of turbulence in Iran following the election. There is massive discontent with the Ahmadinejad administration, and it actually goes beyond Ahmadinejad. I think if you could do a real poll, which is, of course, not possible in that situation, you would find that support for the Islamic Republic of Iran is way below half. Now, we ought to be able to make something of that. we should have started years ago putting ourselves in a position to make something of it, since it has been clear for a very long time that this was a very unpopular regime. It's now undeniable. So I think the key to stopping an Iranian nuclear weapon is a change in that regime, and I think the most likely way to achieve it is when the people of Iran decide to throw off this.
So, but if everything has to be put in the context of the tumult, does that imply a case for pressure on the regime in order to
Let me give you
to exacerbate
a concrete
the
example. There's a lot of talk about, and even some legislation making its way through Congress, talk about trying to limit the importation of refined petroleum product into Iran. Roughly half of the gasoline that goes in Iranian cars and trucks and tanks, for that matter, every day, is imported. And there are only 4 refineries in Iran. A combination of a disastrous accident at 1 or 2 of those refineries and real restraint in the sale of refined product could bring Iran essentially to a halt. And when you get very unhappy citizens queuing up for hours to get 10 liters rationed in the tank, who knows what result that would have. There are things we could do, in my view, to assist those in Iran who want to change their regime.
So, Walter, do you accept the proposition that a narrative of pressure and external sanctions and disrupted fuel supplies aids popular resistance or revolt against the Iranian Republic, or does it only reinforce the Revolutionary Guard's narrative of siege and conspiracy that they use to justify their grip on power?
This is one of those wonderful questions that when you're president, you have to give an answer to, even though you don't know the answer. And I think the reality is Barack Obama will have to decide between these 2 courses of evidence, with a lot of smart people telling him that each one of them is a disaster or each one of them will work. And this is one of the reasons presidents age pretty quickly in office. But I would say there's another factor we need to take on board, which is that there are other countries in the Middle East with a concern in the Iranian nuclear program, and the president may not have a completely free hand in that Israel could launch some sort of a strike on its own, and that it might well be that the Iranians would assume that had U.S. complicity, whether it did or didn't, or in any case might lash out against American interests in response in a way that would be very difficult for the U.S. to avoid a military response back. So I think part of what the president has to think about is that he is not fully in control of all the factors that could present him with very serious decisions. The other thing I think that's important to keep on board is that if the president were now to avow that he has given up the attempt to stop Iranian progress toward a nuclear weapon, this would be a spectacularly unpopular decision. The last time I looked, 61% of the people polled said they favored military action against the Iranian nuclear program. Now, part of the problem is, would that same 61% still support you 9 months in to your military actions against Iran? But nevertheless, I think one reason that a policy of relaxing and learning to live with an Iranian bomb hasn't been avowed by the administration is because you can't, in American politics, do that. And so, in this sense, we may well be trapped into a policy which cannot succeed and which we cannot change. That may actually be where the administration sits right now. Again, presidents earn their paychecks.
Yeah, well, we've reached the 2 o'clock hour, and I think that's an excellent place to conclude. Thank you.